welcome all of you to this discussion. Now, I am going to discuss on a very important topic, that is Government of India Act 1919. The Government of India Act 1919 was passed by British Parliament to further expand the participation of Indians in the Government of India. Since the Act embodied reforms as government recommended by a report of Edwin Montagu, who was Secretary of State for India, and Lord Chelmsford, who was Viceroy and Governor General of India at that time. It is also called as Montagu-Chelmsford reform or simply Montford reforms. The most notable feature of the Act was end of benevolent despotism and introduction of responsible government in India. This Act covered 10 years from 1919 to 1929. The background of this Act 1919 was as follows: that Edwin Samuel Montagu had remained the Secretary of State for India between 1917 and 1922. He was a critic of the entire system by which India was administered. On 20th August 1917, he made a historic declaration in the House of Commons in British Parliament, which is called Montagu Declaration. The theme of this declaration was increasing association of Indians in every branch of administration and gradual development of self-governing institutions and responsible government in India. In November 1917, Montagu had visited India to ascertain views from all sections of polity, including talks with Gandhi and Jinnah. A detailed report on constitutional reforms in India, in quote, that is Montford Report, was published on 8th July 1918. This report became the basis of Government of India Act 1919. The key features of this report, like us, increasing association of Indians in every branch of administration, gradual development of self-governing institutions with a view to the progressive realization of responsible government in India as an integral part of British Empire, progress towards responsible government in successive stages. The preamble of 1919 Act says, the Government of India Act, that is 1919, had a separate preamble. Key points of this preamble were as like India to remain as an integral part of British Empire, gradual decentralization of authority with loosening the supreme hold of the central government. Thus, the preamble of this act suggested for a decentralization unitary form of government. The time and manner towards goal of responsible government will be decided by the British Parliament. Partial responsibility in provinces, but no change in character of the central government. The introduction of diarchy system was happened in this 1919 Act. In Government of India Act 1919, the spheres of the central and provincial governments were demarcated by a division of subjects into central and provincial. Generally speaking, the central subjects included all subjects directly administered by the Government of India or in which extra provincial interests were dominant. The provincial subjects included subjects in which the interest of the provincial essentially predominated. the diarchy was for the provincial governments. The provincial subjects were divided into two categories, like reserved and transferred. The reserved subjects were kept with the governor, and transferred subjects were kept with the governor acting with the Indian ministers. The element of responsibility in diarchy. The diarchy was a gradual transition from irresponsible to responsible government. The provinces were thought to be suitable for experimenting with such scheme. Thus, the provincial subjects were divided into reserved and transferred subjects. The elements of responsibility was like the members in control of the reserved subjects were made responsible to British Parliament through Secretary of State. The ministers who controlled the transferred subjects were made responsible through the Legislative Council to an Indian electorate. While subjects such as land revenue, administration, famine relief, irrigation, administration of justice, law and order, newspapers, borrowings, forests, etc. were kept in reserved list. The subjects such as education, public health and sanitation, public works, agriculture, fisheries, religious endowments, local self-governments, medical services, etc. were kept in transferred list. In other words, the subjects which were considered of key importance for the welfare of the masses and for maintaining peace and order in the state were classified as reserved, while subjects in which there was more local interest were treated as transferred subjects. The changes in Secretary of State for India happened in this act. No substantial changes were made in the office of Secretary of State for India. However, his salary was made a charged expenditure on British revenue this time. Further, the Legislative Council got the opportunity to criticize him at the time of budget. The Indian Council was to be made of not less than 8 and not more than 12 members. Half of the members should have 10 years standing in the Indian public service. Further, their tenure was reduced from 7 to 5 years, and salary was increased from £1,000 to £1,200. Also, the number of Indians on the council was increased from 2 to 3. A provision was made for inclusion of 3 Indians in the 6-member Council of the Governor General. The advocates of Indian High Courts of less than 10 years standing were eligible to be appointed as law minister in the council. The Indian councillors were entrusted with only some important departments. In the Central Legislative Council, the Government of India Act 1919, a bicameral legislature was set up at center with 2 houses as Legislative Assembly and Council of State. This was a primitive model of India's Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. Legislative Assembly was the lower house with 3 years as its tenure. It was made of 145 members, of which 41 were nominated and 104 were elected. The 41 nominated members included 26 officials and 15 non-officials. Governor General was authorized to make nominations from Anglo-Indians, Indian Christians, and Labour to the Legislative Assembly to safeguard their interests. The elected members included 52 general members, 30 Muslims, 9 Europeans, 7 landlords, 4 representatives of Indian community, and 2 Sikhs. This means that the distribution of the seats was not based on population but importance in the eyes of the government. The Council of State. The Council of State of Upper House had 60 members, of which 33 were elected, while 27 were nominated. Out of the 33 elected members, 16 were general, 11 Muslims, 3 Europeans, 1 Sikh. Out of 27 nominated members, 17 were officials and 10 were non-officials. The tenure of Council of State was 5 years. Now see the powers of the Assembly and Council. The Legislative Assembly and Council of State enjoyed similar and concurrent powers except in matters of finance. A bill needed to be passed on both the houses before becoming a law. The budget was presented in both the houses in the same day. But however, all other money bills were first introduced in lower house and then in upper house. Voting on grants could take place only in legislative assembly. Further, if a money bill was passed by assembly but rejected or returned by the assembly with some amendments, the amendments were not acceptable to the assembly until it was certified by the Governor General. The financial power. The Act separated for the first time provincial budgets from the central budget and authorized the provincial legislatures to enact their budgets. But the financial powers of the central legislators were also very much limited. The budget was to be divided into 2 categories, votable and not votable. Votable and non-votable. The votable items covered only 1/3 of the total expenditure. Even in this sphere, the Governor General was empowered to restore any grant refused or reduced by the legislature, if in his opinion the demand was essential for the discharge of his responsibilities. And conflict between legislative assembly and council. Now see, there were 3 instruments to resolve the deadlock between the 2 houses. These instruments were joint committee, joint conference, and joint sittings. Joint committees mean to avoid the possibility of deadlock. Joint conferences mean to solve the differences by agreeing to a conference of equal number of representatives of both the houses, and joint sitting was convened by the governor as a last resort within 6 months of the difference. Then see the elections and franchise. In 1919 Act, under the Government of India Act 1919, the franchise was restricted. There was no universal franchise, no adult suffrage, and no voting powers for women. The qualifications for voting were like they should have a property with rental value, taxable income, or paid land revenue of at least 3,000 in a year. Parallel. They must have past experience in the legislative council. They must have membership of university senate. They should hold certain offices in local bodies. They should have some specified titles. The above qualifications were so much restrictive that there were only 1,700 voters for election of 33 members. Now see powers of the Governor General. No bill of the legislature could be deemed to have been passed unless assented to by the Governor General. However, the latter could enact a bill without the assent of the legislature. He possessed the power to prevent the consideration of a bill or any of its part on the plea that it was injurious to the peace and tranquility of the country. He could disallow a question in the legislature. He had the power to withhold his assent to any bill passed by the legislature, without which it could not become an act. He also had the power to disallow an adjournment motion or debate on any matter. He could enact a law which he considered essential for the safety and tranquility of the empire, even if the legislature had refused to pass it. The other important provisions, like the Act provided for the establishment of a Public Service Commission in India for the first time. This Act also made a provision in its Part 5th that a statutory commission would be set up at the end of 10 years after the Act was passed, which shall inquiry into the working into the system of the government. The Simon Commission of 1927 was an outcome of this provision. The communal representation was extended and 6 Europeans and Anglo-Indians were included. The franchise, that is right of voting, was granted to the limited number of only those who paid certain minimum tax to the government. Now see the critical assessment of this 1919 Act, that is Morlaminto Act. The above descriptions make it clear that the Government of India Act 1919 provided for partial transfer of power to the electorate through the system of diarchy. It also prepared the ground for the Indian federalism, as it identified the provinces as units of fiscal and general administration. But the growing nationalism was not satisfied. The Act of 1919 had 3 major defects from the nationalistic point of view. 1. Absence of responsible government at the center. 2. Separate electorates for different communities. 3rd, although the Montfort report had declared that the separate electorate was a very serious hindrance to the development of the self-government principles, yet separate electorate came to be significant feature of the Indian political life. The introduction of diarchy in the province was too complicated to be smoothly worked. Now see the merits of Government of India Act 1919. Despite of several limitations, the Government of India Act 1919 had some merits. The Government of India Act 1919 marked the end of the policy of benevolent despotism and thus began the genesis of the responsible government in India. It was for the first time that elections to the legislatures were known to the people, and this created political consciousness among the masses. However, those people who had a property, taxable income, and paid land revenue of 3,000 were entitled to vote. The number of the Indian in the was raised to 3 in the Governor General in Council of 8. These Indian members were entrusted to some portfolios such as labor, health, and industries. It was the Government of India Act 1919 whereby the Indians came in direct contact with administration for the first time. This was a very useful experience. It was also for the first time that a number of Indian women got the right to franchise for the first time. Now, under the Indian ministers, some of the far-reaching measures were taken, such as enactment of Madras State Aid to Industries Act 1923, the Bombay Primary Education Act, and Bihar and Orissa Village Administration Act, the Bombay Local Bodies Act 1923, etc. This is all about the Government of India Act 1919. Thank you for listening to me.